wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome, good souls of the planet and beyond, to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight's guest is Professor of Biological Anthropology, Dr. Michael Masters. Be prepared to find out if the future you is the alien contact phenomena. Share your thoughts and experiences with us during or after the show on Facebook, facebook.com/Paranormal Now Radio, Instagram @Paranormal Now, and on Twitter @Paranormal_Now. And of course, join us in the KGRA chat room where all the good people hang out. And I'll try to catch your questions there. If not, the producer, Bill Skywatcher, is always watching the chat room, and he'll try to field them for me if I do miss out on those. Okay. So once again, a reminder that call-ins are now available to all of you. We have rolled out the new HD toll-free phone line sponsored by the Paranormal Radio app. So add this number to your mobile phone so you can call us hands-free at 85-KGRA-LIVE. That's 85-KGRA-LIVE or 855-472-5483. Listen to your cue to call in and pose your questions to the guest or myself. And make sure to save the new Paranormal Radio app hotline number, 85-KGRA-LIVE. And it's just so much easier to call in and ask your questions instead of having to type on those little tiny phone keyboards. Okay, one last thing before we bring Dr. Michael P. Masters on. A friendly reminder to all of you that I've started a new sister program for YouTube called Coffee and UFOs. So this is a video format of what we do here, just abbreviated. It's anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes per episode. You get to see myself and the guests, past guests, or just friends and family, whoever might come on. It's a much more sort of casual approach to the subject, if you will. So a little sense of humor is good going into it. If you could go to the Paranormal Pop YouTube page, just go to YouTube, type in Paranormal Pop Alan B. Smith, it will pop up. And the reason I'm telling you to search for it that way is because it's a brand new channel and we've not yet 100 subscribers. So I don't have a custom URL. So my dream before the end of 2019 is to get a custom URL for YouTube. So we need 100 subscribers. We're only 45 short. So if you can jump on YouTube right now, like and subscribe to Paranormal Pop, I would really, really appreciate it. And I thank you, as always, for your kind support. Dr. Michael P. Masters is a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech in Butte, Montana. He received a Ph.D. in anthropology from The Ohio State University in 2009, where he specialized in hominin evolutionary anatomy, archaeology, and biomedicine. Collectively, Dr. Masters' background, education, and current research program combine to offer a unique perspective and a novel approach to addressing unanswered questions pertaining a widely recognized yet poorly understood aspect of modern global culture. His new book, Identified Flying Objects, a Multidisciplinary Scientific Approach to the UFO Phenomena, challenges readers to consider new possibilities while cultivating conversations about our ever-evolving understanding of time and time travel. And I think you get the idea of where we're going with this. So first, let's welcome Michael onto the show. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, yeah. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this topic, I think many people have discussed this, right? This is a curiosity. And I think it's nice to have an expert like yourself to maybe do a little bit more deep data exploration with us through the research and education that you have. Because it's easy for someone to sort of speculate that aliens that are visiting now have come from the future, us. But the question is how is that even possible? What is the evidence for that you see? And what is the probability of that even occurring? So let's start from before that subject began for you. There must have been something that sort of segued you into this line of research. What was that?
Well, I was actually a wee lad. I was about 8 years old and kind of had some sort of strange thought in my head.
I've had those too.
Yeah, no, more often than I'd like to admit. Yeah, no, it's just a simple little image of like a early hominin form, a modern human, and an alien form, specifically the one from Willie Strieber's book Communion, which I was looking at the time that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I guess it just sort of made me think about a possible connection there and went about researching it. And yeah, like you said, a lot of other people have also considered this. It's really intuitive. It makes a lot of sense. So it was kind of cool to publish the book and then find out just how many others have considered it in different ways and have even tried to go about writing about it. Or I even came across a song recently called Aliens Are Us in the Future or something like that by a couple pretty famous musicians. So yeah, no, it's been great. As George Knapp told me, he's seen this presented a lot, just never from a biological standpoint. And from what I've seen, that's true. I mean, there's been a lot of people that look at the physics of it and the physics of the craft and time travel. But I took a very evolutionary approach to the question.
Yeah, often people use the word unique to describe their work, but I think in this case that does apply appropriately because this is a unique approach because you are approaching it from a biological standpoint. If we started from just the tiniest little organics and they be built into single cell creatures, and then we became more complex and more complex, is there evidence in our natural selection and evolution that points to this future? And I think that's what I think is most fascinating. What was the first inkling through the evolutionary evidence that you've studied that pointed in that direction for you?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few things early on. Although I gotta tell you, I don't know if you heard that music playing in the background. That was accidental cue on. I've been trying to find this YouTube channel you were talking about in the intro, because I was going to help you get to your 100 subscribers. And
thanks, Mike.
I can't find it anywhere. What'd you say it was called again?
It's called Paranormal Pop. P-O-P, Paranormal Pop, Alan B. Smith. Those are the search keys you want to put in there. It should pop right up. And see, that's
there's another one called Paranormal Pop Culture that it took me to.
No.
And that guy has 322 subscribers, so he must have just gotten his URL.
Well, the hope is that we'll get exponential subscribers once we can actually get a URL.
Yeah, no,
thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll get it eventually. I guess now's not the time to do it. Perhaps I just wanted to. I don't know. I guess I got frustrated, especially when the music started playing in the background.
It's funny because we do that. We're such a multitasking culture because we do think, oh, this will take me just a quick second.
Yeah.
This other thing. And oftentimes it's true.
Yeah. But I mean, if I would have just hit subscribe, you'd have no idea I was even trying and failing at that endeavor. So, but you're right. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And you're talking about how terrible you are at using the internet on a radio show all of a sudden. Anyhow, so what points to the future? Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. And the more I studied hominin evolutionary anatomy and especially craniofacial anatomy, but any number of areas of research along the way just sort of kept indicating the same outcome. And one thing I tried to avoid, and you're right, as you mentioned earlier, it's easy to speculate about this and what might happen to us in the future to give us big eyes and freaky little fingers and stuff like that. But I really tried to avoid any of that in the book. And instead of speculating about what might happen between now and then, I primarily focused on what's happened leading up to now. And there are some very long-term changes in hominin evolution, which have continued regardless of what might happen after the present, where we are now, as anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens, whatever the circumstances of our future, we are still likely to see the continuation of trends that have persisted for millions of years, in some cases, 5 to 6 million years of evolutionary history. So it's a pretty conservative approach to the question, and tries to avoid teleology and speculation, and just kind of looking at what's happened to get us to where we are now, and kind of tying us now into us in the future based on looking at us now and us in the past.
Well, one thing I'd like to bring up, the symbolism that we typically see of evolution is the hunched over ape, and then a less hunched over ape, and then a hominin, and then so forth. And then we have a straight up standing human, right? But the human tree is a tree. It's not linear. So how does that factor in? Because can you see a straight line right into this like alien future? But that's not how evolution has worked in the past. Are we going to keep branching off as a species?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have, but that doesn't change the way we represent it as that line. Mm-hmm. It's an oversimplification of our tree, but
don't you think it's a misleading?
No, I don't. To some extent it is. In the earlier version of the book, I actually had a cladogram below it, which shows our actual relationships and non-relationship, cladistically speaking, to the chimpanzee on the left side. They're obviously our closest living relative, but it has to be a separate line. Mm-hmm. And then I realized it just made the cover look kind of busy, and it is more accurate to represent it that way, but it's not necessary, and the vast majority of readers aren't going to know what the hell it was anyway. So I decided to take it off. But yeah, so imagine that family tree, right? How do you draw a family tree from the side?
You just draw a tree.
Yeah, but how do you look at that from the side with those humans walking? If you look at every tree that's drawn, a phylogenetic chart as we call it, you're looking at it from above and you see the branches coming off. Mm-hmm. So you're representing 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions. But if you turn sideways and you're looking at that same thing from the side, which is how we would have to see them standing up, all of a sudden it's one line. See what I'm saying?
Kind of, I think.
It would be busy. There's a lot of other of those individuals standing behind it, clouding up that line. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the walking upright, walking more upright, walking all the way upright thing. There's all of that stuff in between. But my point is that it's just harder to represent from that angle, and that's why you get the oversimplified version. It doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it simplified and something that's easier to represent. But you're right, the tree, all the different branches, and there was even interbreeding across these branches where they weren't complete speciation events. So, if you're looking at it from above and you have all of those branches visible, you would see the Australopithecines, Anamensis early on, Afarensis, Africanus, leading up to early Homo, and then Homo erectus, and then you'd have more branches coming off all of the while. The extinct ones, the robust Australopithecines, they were an offshoot that died out around the time of Homo erectus. So there's certain ones like that you just don't need to represent. They're an offshoot that died out. So another way of thinking of that standard oversimplified representation is that you're just selecting ones from our specific lineage going back in the past, and then just disregarding the other branches that, even though they contributed genes to these individuals on that one line, don't necessarily need to be represented.
I continue to hear these arguments that there are missing links, or a missing link still, and then yet I hear from the scientific community that no, that's not true. There isn't a missing link. So which is it?
Yeah, no, there's no missing link anymore. And I tell people, if they hear somebody use that term in an argument, then they're not talking to somebody that's worth talking to anymore. Because it's an old idea that had been tossed around at a time when we did have gaps. There were definitely gaps in the fossil record. So in that sense, it may have been relevant at the time, but now it's an issue of really a lack of communication on our part as paleoanthropologists. We have a very clear picture of our evolutionary history all the way back to when we split off with what would eventually become the common chimpanzee and the pygmy chimpanzees. And there aren't gaps, there aren't missing links anymore. We know about our deep evolutionary history. The problem is we don't always communicate that to the general public. Or if we do, it's a short story about a new hominin that was discovered somewhere, and it comes out and it's big news. But all of the details, the minutia of what we do, looking at individual changes and this part of this bone here with CT scans and all of these technologies, it's just we talk to each other about these things in academic journals. But unless you see something in Nature or Science that's a big find, all of those little details don't come out. So we have a very good understanding of our hominin fossil record, but we could do better to teach others about it. I mean, I guess in a sense, that's what I'm doing right now is informing the listener about just how rich our evolutionary past is and how we really don't have gaps in the same way that we used to.
Right. And I know not everybody watches PBS, but it's very informative, the number of shows they have on Nova. Now, it may run contradictory some of the mainstream ideas of science to some of the ideas that we entertain or may believe on this program. But by and large, everything that you absorb from programs like that, I think, is educational, and I think more people need to tune into that. And I wonder, how are people stuck on old ideas that are 20 plus years old? How does that happen?
Well, I think you hit on a big part of it, and especially 20 years ago, we didn't have the Kardashians, and we didn't have social media. So we're just more distracted. We live more in the moment. We're more entertained by things that don't necessarily get at the roots of our evolutionary history or address major geopolitical or economic situations. People don't have the attention span. They don't have the interest like they used to. I mean, look at the history of Discovery Channel, History Channel, TLC, for God's sakes, used to be the learning channel, for God's sakes. And now that's where you get all of your housewives fighting about whatever glass slipper situation they're dealing with at that moment. And people eat it up. They love it. So, yeah, I mean, you can't necessarily fault us entirely for not communicating as well. There's just not a market for it. And even that stuff that's popularized on Nova and BBC and other places, it just doesn't have the reach that you think it would. And it's a big issue with what I'm doing, too. I've been working with a TV production company to develop the book into a docu-series and podcast and maybe some other things. And you got to find that balance. How far to the entertainment side do you go, and how much do you stay with the science? And there's obvious examples now of ones that have gone clearly to the entertainment side and completely dismissed science altogether. And there's others with some respectability that try to look at bigger questions. And no matter what, it's just where we are as a society. We're obviously leaning more toward the science communication with good graphics and interesting hosts and guests and things like that. But it's also, it still needs to be entertaining. There's no way around that. So I think, it's unfortunate that we are where we are, but who knows? Maybe it'll change. Maybe people will start demanding something that has some validity, some scientific merit.
Yeah, well, people were interested in the History Channel. It was a popular channel until other forms of entertainment started dominating, and was distracting.
Yeah, that's true.
And so people were into it, but they were just stopped being into it when there was so much more eye candy out there to get sucked into. And it used to be the History Channel was basically a series of documentaries all day, all night long.
I used to love the History Channel. I mean, you also have it happened with a lot of different forms of media, and you're right. It coincided with just like MTV. That they were perfectly fine doing music videos, but then once reality shows became popular, boom, just shifted focus to.
Well, they did start the reality show fervor with the Real World in the 90s, so it was kind of
that's true.
fault.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, I guess that's a bad example.
But I understand. So, okay, so now how do we educate people on how evolution actually worked to the best of our understanding, and also entertain the idea that maybe there's alien intervention? And how do those things go together? Or we become the aliens, whatever it is, because both of those sides of the story are a little fantastical.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's what I do for a living, I guess, is educate people on our deep evolutionary history. There are still taboos at the moment regarding anything related to aliens, so I do feel like that's changing. I get the real sense that people are starting. Well, I'm slightly biased because I just published a book about it, and I get people coming up to me all the time saying, "Hey, I've been thinking about this for a while," and people I had no idea. Like, people I've known very well that have been really interested in this for a while, and of course they're coming up to talk to me because it's a safe space, and I just wrote a whole book about it. But I get the sense that even beyond those interpersonal conversations, that we're just finally starting to whittle away the stigma that surrounds the topic. And I don't treat it like it's stigmatized anymore. I mean, I'm not going to bust into class and be like, aliens are us from the future, and go on a big long tangent. But I also don't go in there and talk about smoking weed or doing mushrooms or anything either, or any other thing that's not within the realm of an Anthropology 101 class. So you stay focused on what you're doing regardless. But there is, I think, a connection. And the reason I wrote the book is because I'm trying to highlight the actual scientific evidence for what could be a connection if this is a real phenomenon. But I am careful to separate those two and to not just make blanket statements about things without some evidence to back it up.
Sure. And you do go to conferences, though, where you are side by side with people who have other ideas that are very unconventional. So you might be able to walk into a classroom and present yourself more conservatively with this speculative idea, right? And be taken more seriously. But if you go to a UFO convention, then that kind of muddies the water for you a little bit, doesn't it?
No, not at all. I was just at the International UFO Congress last week in Phoenix, and I just gave a lecture that is very much centered on the research in the book that has to do with morphological and cultural changes in our evolutionary history and the physics of time and time travel, published research, current peer-reviewed academic research in anthropology and physics, primarily at this talk. At a MUFON talk a couple of months earlier, I also brought in some current scientific research from astrobiology and astronomy as well, and it's no different than what I teach in class. It's just an audience that isn't, I guess, isn't there for the same things. When I go into class, my students paid money to be there. They know what we're going to be talking about. It's very well laid out in the syllabus. At a UFO conference, you're right, there's a lot of people talking about very different things, some of them entirely speculative, completely unfounded. But that's fine. I mean, people like to think outside the box, and
sure.
To some extent, it's okay to put things out there. But as long as you acknowledge that it's speculative and it's not actually backed up by anything. But no, what I do at those conferences is the exact same thing I do in class. I just put it in the context of this phenomenon.
All right, well, let's hold it right there. We're up at the first break. We have so much more to cover in regard to this topic. We've just barely scratched the surface. So stick with us as we come back on the other side with Dr. Michael Masters. And I do have a question from Neutron from the chat room that we will get to. And Michael, when we get back from the other side, I have to ask you about your opinion on Storm Area 51, which is just a couple of days away. And I think a lot of us will be watching live streams with a bag of popcorn that night. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio. We will be right back. And we have a lot to cover on the topic of, are we the aliens, but just our future selves? And how does that work? Because we all know the time paradox issues with time travel. So that's another question we'll have to get to with Michael Masters. But first, I have a question from the chat room from Neutron Michael. And in regard to the earlier piece of our conversation, is it true what's been said that humans have, our skulls are somehow connected to our vertebrae in a way that reptiles have, but not in the way the ape monkey family has? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. So how does that work?
Well, I haven't heard that before, but yeah, I mean, I guess in the sense that they're still quadrupedal. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't ever heard that before, that our skulls attach in the same way as reptiles. We can see the way in which they attach in our closest living hominoid relatives, the great apes, and it is very similar to our own. And even in looking at our evolutionary history, we see a slow progression from the specific area of the skull we're talking about is the posterior cranial base. It's made up of three parts: the anterior, the middle, and the posterior, and that's where the foramen magnum sits, and that's the big hole where our spinal cord passes. And over evolutionary time, largely because we stood upright, and in doing so, going from being quadrupedal, meaning walking on all fours, to being bipedal, meaning walking on two limbs, we had to rotate our head down so we could see where we were going. If you imagine a chimp standing straight up, it's looking at the sky unless it does so.
Sure.
So in doing so, and for us to continue being bipedal, that foramen magnum had to move anteriorly, so more toward the front. And that caused a flexing of the cranial base, which was very important for our brains growing bigger. But as far as getting from there to here, it was a very slow progression, changing from this more hominoid cranial base to a more hominin. And we can actually look at that angle of the cranial base as one of the traits that changes over this period. So, I mean, it's possible that similar things happened in the evolutionary history of certain lizards. But if that was the case, it would be more an example of analogy rather than homology, or synapomorphies, as we call them specifically, which are just traits that we share with other animals because we have common ancestry. So, for instance, our lack of a tail is homologous with that of gorillas and chimps and orangutans because we all shrunk down that trait early in our evolutionary history, and the common ancestor didn't have a tail either. But when you get things like the wings of bats versus the wings of butterflies or the wings of birds, those are all examples of analogies where they just developed independently. And if that's the case with reptiles, I would say it's probably the latter, where it was just we independently evolved a similar cranial base.
Is there any evidence at all that we could evolve into a reptilian-like? Are there genes that are dormant within us that can actually awaken and redirect our evolution?
I mean, yeah, we share something like 30% of our DNA with a banana and a mosquito and other kinds of plants and things, because
so we could be a walking banana.
Eventually we could devolve into bananas again, I guess, or any sort of reptile. I mean, it's not likely to happen because with evolution you get changes that tend to build on what came before, rather than just all of a sudden dip back 500 million years or anything. But Yeah, so it wouldn't necessarily be an awakening of certain traits, but actually, I don't think it's likely to happen in any case that we would ever become more reptile-like. Mammals are very successful, more successful than the reptiles, especially the dinosaurs who didn't make it, and then we took over once they started dying out. So I think the things that have made us so successful in our adaptability and our homeothermy, being able to control our own body temperature, which is huge, I find it unlikely that we would just start growing tails and scales and shrinking our brains and growing big teeth, things like that.
Is there new evidence to suggest that maybe reptiles weren't all cold-blooded?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, that's one of those things we can't know about them.
Right.
Because it doesn't preserve in the fossil record. But that and the feathers, we used to think they were all just scaly, and obviously some of them had feathers.
Right.
Direct descendants of or birds are the direct descendants of ones that did, at least early on. So, yeah, I mean, we can see their bones and their teeth, but beyond that, we can't really know. The main reason, I mean, a lot of lizards are. It's a pretty common trait. They don't have homeothermy, and we can suppose that most dinosaurs didn't either. And in the context of the evolutionary niches that we occupied, we were living underground and coming out at night because we could regulate our body temperature, and the dinosaurs who relied on the sun had to be out soaking up the sun just to do stuff. And then once they died and we came out, that whole relationship sort of indicates that we benefited from that trait, and it wasn't necessarily something that they had.
Well, I suppose being cold-blooded, it supports the idea that after a asteroid catastrophe hits our planet and the sky is blocked, the sun is blocked, that would be devastating to a cold-blooded species.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. In fact, I just gave that lecture this morning in my Anthropology 101 class, and wish we would have had this conversation last night, because that's a great thing to point out. Yeah, that's the thing. If the dust is going up in the air, the volcanoes are erupting, it's going to create that nuclear winter, which to us wasn't a big deal because we could generate heat through food. But for those that relied on the sun, if it just doesn't show up anymore for a while, pretty much boned.
I suppose my initial question, I was thinking in terms of future us. If we are the aliens, we've also heard of many reports that aliens are reptilian-like. So is that something that's believable for you?
Well, they also call them human-like. So, yeah, I think we try to find things that we can compare things to, and obviously the word "like" being added at the end is exactly what we're doing there. But I've heard insect-like as well. And what I hypothesize is that the variation in general, because some are Nordic, some are compared to East Asian individuals, some look extremely human, slightly bigger eyes, which is partly why it blows my mind that this isn't the default theory. But if the example I usually give is that if we traveled back into our own past 100 years ago, we're going to look more or less identical to what we do now. Our culture will be very different, but we'll look more or less the same. Going back 300,000 years, now we're very, very different, but still entirely human and similar in our overall form. But 2 million years, 3 million years in the past, now we look very different from those individuals, and we might even look like bugs to them, or weird reptile creatures with our big bulbous heads and our tiny faces and our big eyes. So going into the future, I refer to this in the book as temporal ancestry. Ancestry refers to the current differences among different groups from sub-Saharan Africa, Native Americans, East Asians, and so forth. And that's just a snapshot of our evolutionary past. We adapted to different environments. We evolved in these different regions, and some of our observable differences are just the result of that. But going into the future, the farther you go into that future, you're going to innately get more different looking individuals, the same way that we see as we look into the past. So, the ones that are big bug-eyed, insect-like or reptile-like individuals as they're described, and until we have a picture, or even ideally an actual living, breathing human from each of these different time periods, we can't know exactly what traits they have at what time period. But we do know it is safe to assume that the deeper into the future you go, the more different they're going to be. And part of that temporal ancestry aspect of this may be those reports of very, very different creatures like the reptiles and the insectoids.
However, even if that's true, that we can look significantly different hundreds of thousands of years from now, or 50,000 years from now, we're living in a time where humans can now affect our own biology. So in a world where transhumanism can exist, can we not expedite that process? Perhaps these aliens are not from 100,000 years from now, but are 500 years from now.
Yeah, I wouldn't say however there. I would say and additionally, because absolutely. Yeah, we've got the CRISPR, we've got all of these gene splicing techniques. We have AI that's developing at a tremendous rate. It's very possible that those individuals could be robots or some biologically altered human in the distant future that has to withstand temperatures or radiation that we can't. So maybe we modified them for that purpose. Absolutely. I definitely think that's something to be taken into consideration.
Can these modifications, physical modifications with the intent of being physical adaptations or modifications, can those accidentally or inadvertently affect our intelligence?
I mean, anything can inadvertently affect things negatively, and that almost seems to be the default state. What we call it, Murphy's Law here in the U.S. or Sod's Law over in England across the pond. But yeah, no, that's a very real potentiality. And I actually heard that a lot last week at the UFO Congress. People asking about, God, I think I had this conversation 4 or 5 times. What if we do start messing with our genome, even something simple like trying to cure cancer, fix some problem, some congenital disease that we can only fix through our genes, and then something changes in our genome, that trait spreads, and it initiates some sort of negative thing in us, potentially affecting our reproduction. I think that's a scary but real possibility.
And that's the exact argument that's occurring now with genetic modified foods, right? That you can tweak one gene or one protein, but there might be an unexpected side effect that could adversely affect the food we're eating.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of a buffer zone because we break it down with the acids in our stomach and then absorb the nutrients. But yeah, there's the potential for something to go wrong in those crops themselves in particular.
Sure.
And yeah, it scares me too, like what Monsanto is doing with their corn varieties that would basically not replicate, not hybridize, not self-replicate. They're not asexual, but they weren't able to reproduce themselves, and they made them that way so that farmers couldn't save their seeds. And then those blew into other people's fields, and all of a sudden they, even though they weren't buying Monsanto's corn and their seed, now not only did their corn just die and they couldn't save their own seeds, but Monsanto sued them for using their varieties without purchasing them. They would accuse them of stealing them, even though they just blow on the wind. And that's kind of a socio-political example, but there's a lot of things that
sociopathic example.
Nice one. Yeah, I like it.
Okay, so this question from Bill Skywatcher himself: is it possible, and this reminds me of the H.G. Wells' Time Machine, Is it possible that grays may be an evolution of humans if we are forced to reside underground for thousands of years due to climate or some type of catastrophe? Big eyes, gray skin from lack of sunlight.
Yeah, it's a possibility. There's a lot of potential contributors. I like I said, I try to avoid talking about what could happen going forward and focus more on the past and the traits, especially the ones we already talked about with the big globular neurocrania, the big round heads, the small faces, the enlarged eyes. Those are all already trends that have been occurring throughout our evolutionary past. The gray skin is also interesting because really since the rise of agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution, you have a number of traits associated with the self-domestication process. We were domesticating cows and sheep and camels, but we were also domesticating ourselves inadvertently and selecting for pro-social behaviors. And in doing so, there's a number of both morphological and behavioral changes that take place in humans, and we can see these in the same way we can in studying the morphology of other animals. But one in particular is a loss of pigmentation. And that loss of pigmentation, just a decline in the amount of melanin in the skin, could help explain the grayish hue that's reported in the skin of these extraterrestrials, as I call them, even outside of any sort of physical effect. And we're not really subject to natural selection in the same way that we have been throughout most of our evolutionary history. But there are still things that happen. We still change. They're more non-directional genetic drift type things. So if we lived underground, we didn't need pigmentation, it would start to go away. And that's definitely possible. But even just in looking at current trends and past trends, especially in recent human history, could help explain that commonly reported gray characteristic too.
So let's just say we become a space-faring species. Could that have, and I know it's speculation, but could that have an effect on those similar traits that we see in what people report as being aliens?
Yeah, certainly. Again, we don't have any way of knowing how much or when or what would take place. The future is still a very dark void to us. Traveling into the future actually is pretty easy. We might be able to do that in the near future, maybe even within our lifetimes. But getting back, it may be a one-way ticket until we figure out backward time travel. So we might be able to see those things at some point if we're able to also figure out how to get back and tell people about it before they left. But no, that characteristic or those characteristics, because you live in space, there's less gravity. We see those with astronauts now. There's a lot of changes that take place when you are not in the gravity of Earth. And we've been evolving to this gravity, especially us, especially hominins, because we stood upright and we decided to do it on 2 legs instead of 4, which has really put us at the mercy of the 9.8 meters per second squared gravity that exists on this planet. So even just getting off of the Earth for long periods of time is going to cause changes. Whether those are heritable or not, whether they're actually passed down to our offspring is a different question.
Sure.
But
I think I sidetracked you a little bit with my comment on transhumanism or intervention in our own biology. So a question from Ron from Earth Radio is, how long would it take for the so-called gray alien type to evolve? So if biology takes its natural course, how long in the future do you think it would be before we reach that place?
Yeah, it's a great question. I used to go out of my way to not answer that question because I can't know. And then George Norrie made me do it one time, and I decided that to be fair, I would answer that for everyone that asks, because it is a popular question.
Yeah,
it is. I mean, yeah, how long until we're them? And a lot of people, there's a lot of things at play, and I do address this in the book. I never actually give a number which I'm sure pissed a lot of people off when they read the book. And I talked about it for a quarter of a chapter or so without giving a number. But there's a lot of things at play that make it difficult to predict. And one of them, very short version, is just how much variation already exists in humans today. We have the ancestral, or what was formerly known as racial variation. We have sex, we have age. All of these things make us look different now. So if you were to pick up and just randomly pick up a 2-year-old and 2-year-old white person and compare them to a 90-year-old Asian person of the opposite sex, you're going to have very different individuals in front of you. And the same thing, as I mentioned, through time, the further into the future we go, the more variation there is, just because of time. But another problem is that we're accelerating our change. It's not this steady linear shift, in which case we could potentially make predictions based on past trends. But it seems to be an acceleration. And really, since agriculture, there have been a number of changes that have sped things up in different ways. So to be completely honest, I have no idea. But if I had to guess, that quintessential gray alien form with the very human-like characteristics, they're all very human-like in so many ways, but with larger eyes, rounder head, smaller face, I'd put it between probably 8,000 years and 15 to 18,000 years.
Okay, so that's not that far off on an evolutionary scale.
No, it's pretty short term. I could be off by a factor of 100,000 years or so. I should have given a plus or minus at the end of that, because I've got no idea, and this is what I did my dissertation on and written papers about since then. However, coming back to what we were talking about previously, there's still that issue of genetic modification, and maybe things happen faster because we're selecting for greater intelligence or lack of the wisdom tooth, because it gets in the way of us even today. So there's a lot of things we could potentially be doing to ourselves to speed it up in the future.
But why even speculate on this in the first place?
Yeah, that's what I'm screaming, brother. Thank you.
Well, anyone who's curious, Identified Flying Objects, the book, you can go to idflyobj.com. idflyobj.com. So, but seriously, because to talk to people in the academic setting about this, there must have been a motivation for you to do this, right? Otherwise, you could just, talk with your colleagues or have conversations and chats about this idea. But why try to formulate it and really examine it out in the open like you do?
Well, because we need to change the conversation. We need to change the dialogue around this. And the only way it's going to ever get legs in what has been an extremely dismissive group of people, my academic peers in many of these different fields. Some are more open-minded, but for the most part, anytime the word UFO or alien comes up, they just instantly roll their eyes and walk away. And that's on them. They're the ones that are to blame for that, because they're not doing their jobs as scientists. It's our role to ask questions and to try to figure things out. And people that just instantly ignore any valid, testable, falsifiable scientific hypothesis because it's stigmatized are doing a disservice to science and to their academic field. So I think it's important to avoid speculation and to try to present a grounded, falsifiable model that's rooted in very well-established scientific facts throughout our evolutionary past, both with regard to our biology, culture, and with regard to what we understand about time and the universe. So I wanted to offer up, and part of why it took 7 years to write this book is I wanted to offer up an explanation that was rooted in these different scientific disciplines, and that was peer-reviewed and edited and readable to not only my academic peers, but to anyone interested in this subject. And that's a fine line to walk. It's hard to find that balance between people with no specialty in these areas versus those that are very, very specialized in these areas, and to make something that's understandable and interesting to both parties.
So it's almost like you were corralling, right, some of the more wild ideas, but by you doing this work and presenting it as you do, you're kind of like saying, okay, everybody, really fascinating, entertaining ideas. Let's kind of bring it in and try to ground it.
Kinda, yeah. I mean, I don't think that it's really that out there anymore. I mean, there's been senators getting debriefed, and the Navy.
Oh yeah.
But defending, or not defending, not yet anyway. But stating that these videos are real and they didn't want anybody to see them, but they are real, and changing their reporting protocols. Like we're starting to get to the point where we can have this conversation. I had no idea what it would be like before I published the book. I was hoping that I wouldn't be instantly ridiculed and ostracized, and I've been very, very pleased with the response, overwhelmingly supportive response from my academic colleagues, the UFO community. It's been really great. Mm-hmm. And I think we needed this. I think we need somebody to stick their head out and say, you know what, let's talk about this. I don't care. The ones that aren't going to engage in the discussion, fine. They have their own biases. They have their own issues they have to sort out. But I think it's high time we start talking about this shit.
Okay. Bravo to you. I'm glad that you are. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation, which we will continue on the other side of this last break. This is Alan B. Smith for KGRA Radio. You're listening to Paranormal Now. I appreciate everyone tuning in every week and all of your support. Yes, we are talking about us becoming the aliens in the future. And how did we get there? What does that mean? I have so many more questions for Dr. Michael P. Masters. Hang in there. We will be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your grateful host. My guest tonight is Dr. Michael P. Masters, and we are talking about our evolution becoming the extraterrestrials that some of us fear and some of us seem to have a connection with, which would make sense to me if that's our future us, and we are not malevolent. But we'll see where that future goes. And Michael had just mentioned a moment ago, like he'd like to be around here to see us do that. And I do wonder how far in the future it will be, or how near to the present will it be that we get to see our own species really take off and go not just to the outer limits of our solar system, but throughout this galaxy. Will we find the way to get there? Will the Albuquerque drive work? Will any kind of warp speculative drive actually become a reality within our lifetime? I hear contradictory arguments in that regard. One second I hear it takes the power of a black hole and we'll just never be able to do that. And then I hear that physicists are working on theories to bypass that so that we can harness the energy to go into warp speed and get out there. And if we do, that would fundamentally change our relationship, not to just this planet, not just to ourselves, but to existence itself. And if there's one thing that we understand about evolution, it's that pressures can change a species. And I would say that even though exploration out into the space is expansive, I think that it would be like an outside pressure, because the change would be so immense that how would it affect us psychologically as well as physiologically for those of us that do go out there, come back, get married, have kids, go back out again, come back to Earth, repeat, rinse, and repeat. We could be a very different species in a fairly short amount of time. And I don't know, Michael, is that scary or is that exciting?
Which part? The space travel part?
No, us becoming something we don't know right now.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the only constants change, so I think that I mean, I think we see this on a microcosm now. It's why we have the progressive and conservative views, is that some people are excited about the future and want to see what's coming next and make a better future, and some people are happy with slavery and patriarchy and stuff. So I don't know. I mean, it depends on whether you're forward looking or backward looking. I think there's only fear if you tend to look backward and love the past, and only hope and aspirations for the future if you're looking forward. But I don't know. That's obviously an oversimplification of the situation. But one thing I have heard a lot in regard to the first thing you mentioned is a lot of people who have read the book come up to me and they say, before I read this, I was terrified of an alien invasion, because they know this is real. They know this is a real phenomenon. They didn't know what it was and just assumed that these creatures want to murder us all and take our resources. And for them to have this framed in the context of future humans and our shared humanity, in fact, they need us to exist now for them to exist in the future. There's really no incentive for them to ever hurt us, since they're descended directly from us. For a lot of people, that's alleviated some of those fears that they had.
There's something really, I love this conversation, by the way, because there's something so exciting for me about us. I guess that's, anthropomorphical centric, right? But and that we're not looking at necessarily documents, which I enjoy, to determine whether there's evidence of aliens, but we're looking at ourselves and asking the questions if we are the evidence. I just find it's so
and that's a really good way of thinking of it too, is because we know we're here. We exist. We have more proof of that than you could ever need in your life. We don't know if any upright walking humanoid forms exist on other planets out in outer space. We have no evidence for that, but we have a lot of evidence that we exist now. Mm-hmm. And in the context of science, that's very important. And that's, again, why I mentioned that this is a testable hypothesis, because all it's saying is that we'll continue to exist and the same past trends will continue into the future. That's it. And then it connects that dot with the dots of this UFO phenomenon. But it's not, it's rooted in that fact that we exist now. We have existed in the past. If we continue to exist and we figure out how to time travel, we're likely to see ourselves at all these different times that we existed in the past. I also wanted to mention one other thing too, real quick. You mentioned the fear thing, and I learned recently of this Edgar Mitchell Foundation study. I think it was called the Free Study.
Sure.
Where they interviewed thousands of contactees, and the vast majority of them, as you mentioned, had very positive experiences. They very much enjoyed the company of these future humans. And I think that's, not everybody does. There's exceptions. I think it was something like 5 to 8% were really traumatized by the experience.
Negatively, sure.
Negatively affected, yeah.
My understanding of the study, though, is that in the beginning, when contactees or experiencers had that first experience, it was considered a negative experience. Mm-hmm. Over time, as they had time to contemplate it, or multiple abductions or contacts, whatever it might be, their perception of it changed, which I think is comforting to a degree. And I talked to Mary Rodwell about this, and I think she made some good points, but I still feel like maybe that's part of our own psyche, just trying to deal with the trauma and trying to spin it.
Kind of like the Stockholm Syndrome thing, where we're
exactly
settling into it because it's, I don't know, or maybe just get used to anal probing after a while, or they use more lube or something. I don't know. It seems like something.
You just couldn't let that one go, huh?
Well, I mean, you get used to stuff. No matter how strange things are, you normalize it after a while. And I remember the first time I went to South Africa, it was just hugely different. I was living in the bush in the middle of this old growth forest in South Africa on the other side of the earth. And everything for 2 weeks straight was just so strange to me. And then after that, it became very normalized and very comfortable. And then when I came back to the US, like turning on a light switch or like a faucet and having hot water come out was just amazing to me. So we quickly adapt to things no matter how strange they are. And that example I gave you, it exists now in the same time. It's just a different place. But interacting with people in the same place, but from a different time, we'd expect that to start normalizing after a while as well.
And for those of you that are listening to us tonight, if you want to maybe help connect the dots by asking new or intriguing questions that I know you must have, because this is a really curious subject for me as well, you can call in the Paranormal Radio app number, and that is 85KGRA live. Listen for your cue after you call in, and then you can pose your questions to the guest or to myself. So we're going to open those lines up in just a little bit, so stand by. And again, that number is 855-472-5483. Okay, so here, I know you are thinking in terms mostly of the biological aspects, and we'll continue with that. But you have to ask the question, and even in your classes, people must ask the question, well, what is the viability, technically, of us even having the ability to time travel? So let's say we do evolve into these other-looking humans. There really is nothing to say that time travel is feasible at this point.
Well, I would tend to disagree with that statement, as would the vast majority of physicists. Like I mentioned, time travel to the future is time travel, and that is very simple. We do it every time we get on an airplane.
Sure, relativity, yeah.
Relativity, yeah. Backward time travel has been debated. However, the overwhelming consensus is that there's nothing in the laws of physics that prohibit it. And I quoted one of my favorite physicists, David Deutsch, in saying that, and I'm paraphrasing, if there's nothing in the laws of physics that prohibit something, humans will eventually find some technological way of doing it. And I tend to agree with that. We never thought we would have gotten to the moon 200 years ago. Probably 100 years ago, we never thought we'd be able to intercept a comet whizzing through space and gently set something down on top of it to study it. We evolve our culture and technology very quickly, and there's no doubt in my mind that if it is possible, we'll find a way to do it. Things like you mentioned hyperdrive, warp drive earlier, going faster than the speed of light.
Like the M drive.
A lot of things, yeah, there's a lot of things in the laws of physics that say nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Nothing with mass can go faster than the speed of light. So that one instantly has a bit of a roadblock. But with backward time travel, what I do in the book is show where we basically start. I don't go all the way back to Newton or anything like that, but basically since Einstein and his theory of special relativity in 1905 and his Professor Hermann Minkowski's contribution in 1907, 1908, which then Einstein piggybacked off of with regard to the geometry of space-time in his 1915 publication on general relativity. Really, ever since that, and specifically his field equations published in association with his theory of general relativity, there's been a number of solutions that show how time travel not only is possible, but could be logistically carried out. Like what specific parameters of a craft you would have to have in order to create closed time-like curves and warp space-time and bend time back on itself. And what's interesting is the vast majority of them, almost all of them really, involve the rotation of a massive or highly energetic sphere, ring, solenoid, disk is a very common form. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that if it is possible, we're likely going to be able to do it. And then all indications now is that UFO is the actual time machine. It has those properties of a time machine.
But isn't that what's the least feasible thing is the machine itself, not theory, but the ability to harness the power and mechanics that is needed to go back in time.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about an energy source that doesn't exist yet, or one that we haven't harnessed yet. We're talking about materials, metamaterials, that haven't been developed yet. Yeah, the same way that we look at the periodic chart now versus 100 years ago, there's a lot of stuff we added because we created elements, and we can constantly modify those to create new compounds and new materials, and increasingly smaller. Directly below me right now in my office is a nanomaterials lab where they make all kinds of nanofibers and do research at the smallest level of construction, essentially. And that's cutting edge research that's taking place right now, and it's still probably extremely primitive to any human that exists 1,000 years in the future, 5,000 years in the future. What we're doing now will lead up to that technology. They're building on top of what we're doing now. But no, there's obviously no way to make a time machine right now. There's no way to withstand those centrifugal forces or to harness the energy necessary to do it. And that's very likely why they look so different than us. It's going to take a really long time before they're able to do it.
Well, true. And physics seems to get weirder and weirder as time goes on. Scientists have had meager success with teleporting. I think it was metallic particles, right? Like microscopic molecular particles. So if we're in the early stages of experimenting with teleportation, which is... Are you
talking about that Chinese, the quantum entanglement teleportation?
It's really fascinating. I mean, the fact that we're even testing these ideas, and not just talking about it, says something about possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I obviously am a proponent of humans and our ingenuity and our intelligence. I have studied this throughout my academic career, just how much our technology has changed in association with our increased intellect and our larger brains. And I've held in my hands the hand axes that groups 2.5 million years ago have made, or Neanderthals 150,000 years ago have made, and to hold that and to kind of sense the process of constructing it, and then looking at what we have now and how much has changed just in that short period of time, it could absolutely understand how we would figure out the materials needed and the logistics and the engineering needed to send something back in time. I'm a huge proponent of humanity.
How do you feel about people's arguments who say, hey guys, we're wasting way too much money on exploration of space or far out science, and we really need to take care of the people and the problems that we have here now on Earth?
Yeah, I guess it's just my opinion on the situation, which is also what you asked for, so I should probably give it. I don't think those are dichotomous, and I think it's unfortunate when we frame things as black or white. It doesn't have to be we either explore space or we help solve world hunger. That's a false dichotomy. It's creating the straw man fallacy, saying we need to cut money from the space program to help starving children, or we go to space and those people die. That's not the situation. Let's take some money from the military-industrial complex. Let's not fund wars and all of these murderers, these murderous industries that are producing weapons that kill people. Let's not subsidize the oil and gas industry. Let's not subsidize the agricultural industry to overproduce corn that we put in everything that makes us unhealthy, that we then have to subsidize the health industry because there's all these poor people that only eat that crap because we subsidize corn. They now have to go to the doctor more often. They can't afford it, so we have to pay for that. There's a lot of better places to take money in order to fund space exploration. And it's to me, it's about priorities. We should have our priorities in order regardless. We don't have to say that if we go to space, poor people starve. That's a stupid way of looking at it, I think.
Well, a lot of that industrial military complex money is going to space exploration.
It is. That's
many
a good
people
point.
and to what we know. I mean, the X-37B, there's so many aircraft or aeronautical craft that we don't really understand what their purpose is for. We know is being spent there. So we are okay with that, it seems to me. So why not be okay with just
as long as it's put toward defense, and as long as it's put toward us being the strongest military power, so we can brag to everybody about how strong we are, then we're cool with it. But if it's to go out into space and see what's going on in Mars, and it's like, well, but we could be killing people instead. Don't you think that'd be better? Yeah, we've got very backward priorities, and not just in this country, but everybody. And it makes sense. I mean, the reason we're here is because we were better at killing other people than those people were.
Yeah.
To put it bluntly.
Do you think at the anniversary this year of the Apollo 11, there should have been more media hype and more excitement?
Absolutely, yeah. And there was a little bit on Facebook and Twitter, and obviously PBS went balls out with it and did just tons of things, and really highlighting the role that women had in contributing, and all of the calculations that had to be done by hand and just flying by the seat of their pants to re-enter the atmosphere. It's such an interesting story. It comes back to what we were talking about earlier about people just having their priorities elsewhere. They're interested in what the celebrities do, and not one of the most monumental moments in the history of our species. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's an interesting story, and it's told very well on platforms that are publicly funded and don't end up in a lot of other places. But I think it's unfortunate more because it more reflects who we are as a society. Right. There's only so much that the media can do to get that stuff out there. If there's nobody eating up that content, what's the point?
Well, I would argue that if you are a media conglomerate and you are making millions in profits, then there is time to set aside for some healthy patriotism.
Yeah.
And you should, if you can afford to bypass a little bit of profit for something that's healthy for the spirit of the country, why not do that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
I mean, the news media itself is supposed to be of service to the people. And I think that's a responsibility. And I don't know, I was really let down with, there wasn't much of a celebration. I know CNN had a good documentary. We watched it. So, okay, I've got a couple of questions.
Well, hang on. Before we move on with that, too, you can also push it back to those who would organize events. We make a big deal out of lighting a Christmas tree every year. We kill a tree for Jesus. We put some lights on it. Boom, major event. There could have been something, an event that was carried out by the military or NASA or the government that just made all of those media conglomerates pay attention. And to my understanding, there wasn't something like that.
I think you make a very good point, and I hadn't thought of that. It's like the presidential election, right? The government puts on this big ceremony, and it is a big deal, but all the cameras from all the media sources are pointed at this thing, if it's a July celebration or what have you. So I think you're right. I guess, well, I mean, NASA's involved with social media anyway. They're always promoting themselves. So I guess that would be a natural fit for them to sort of take the helm. But then again, I guess that would, cost taxpayer money.
Yeah, there's the budget thing. Children are going to starve if we celebrate the Apollo mission.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's kind of sad. And I understand where people are coming from initially, but it's not intellectually honest. They're not really thinking through that whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so these two questions that I have coming up are in relation to my I don't necessarily like the idea of traveling back in time. I don't like this because it kind of, I love movies like Back to the Future and science fiction.
Yeah. Hey, you're not alone, man. I've met a lot of people that are heavily biased against it, like very vocal, outspoken people. It's funny.
Well, I can't be vocal. outspoken or bias against it, because that's like trying to deny reality. Because if it's possible, then it's possible, or if it's going to happen, it's going to happen.
It doesn't stop them. Why should it stop you?
Well, well, it's just, you have to be honest with yourself. Like, okay, so if this is a possibility, I just don't necessarily like what the consequences could be of that. So we can talk more on that, but I want to get this one question in from Carol Carl, from behind the Obsidian Curtain, also on KTRA on Friday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So going with some of our earlier conversation, why have ET contacts not offered us help if they're coming from the future? What are they doing? Why are they peering in on us and not stepping in and saying, hey guys, we can help solve your problems so you don't have so many billion people starving and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of comes back to what you were just talking about too, and why you don't like the idea of time travel, because it's dirty. There's a confusion of cause and effect, and there's a lot of our normal mainstream views on time, and especially the arrow of time, just don't really make sense in the context of a time machine. One of my favorite physicists, whose work I referenced a lot in the book, is Igor Novikov, and he is probably best known for what's even named after him, known as the Novikov self-consistency principle, and what he advocates, and what his very well-respected colleagues have acknowledged, or at least gotten on board with, including Kip Thorne. I published a paper on this a few decades ago, supporting the Novikov self-consistency principle, is that if you have something, an event from the future, affect something from the past, that's perfectly normal. You can have the future dictate events in the past because they're not separate things anymore. The future, present, as we understand it, and the past are all essentially one, and none of those are ahead of or behind each other in the presence of a time machine. And he's even gone much farther to show how you maintain self-consistency across the future and the past, because anything that you're going to do in that past already exists. Any ramifications of that, any changes, as we think of them, already exist in that future before you even leave. You're just carrying out something that you were always going to do as part of that past, and whatever transpired between that past intervention and the future point from which you left is already there. It's already part of your timeline. So then the question of why not intervene? Why not just sit down and say, hey, we're from the future, we can cure cancer, we can cure AIDS, we can tell you about all kinds of important things that could help your society? That could happen. There's no reason, there's no paradox associated with that. It would be a very quick learning curve for us. We'd have a lot of catching up to do and learning about these things that should be separated by thousands of years, potentially. All of a sudden we have it. And potentially the Roswell crash was one of these things. If it did actually happen, and they, in 1947, received a craft from the deep future, that is a very big jump ahead. And that could help very much contribute to our ability to create anti-gravity devices, time machines, to traverse the cosmos, because we have the control over gravity through most likely the electromagnetic force. So there aren't paradoxes. There aren't necessarily, we even call future time travel a paradox, the twins paradox, where you have two identical twins. One travels in a spaceship for a short period of time at a fraction of the speed of light. They come back, they're much older. There's nothing paradoxical about that, but we still just throw the word paradox at it because like you, and I don't know why you necessarily don't like this subject. I find it fascinating. It was one of my favorite parts
subject.
about writing the book.
Yeah,
but it feels dirty, though. It feels dirty to not just you, but a lot of other people. And a lot of that is because we talk about it as if it's paradoxical. And in movies and TV, we create these situations that are seemingly paradoxical. Back to the Future, everybody's favorite movie from that time period, but they don't do a good job of demonstrating the actual physics of backward time travel because it's entertainment. They're not trying to teach us how this works. But if you actually get into the weeds of how physicists understand time and how they understand the effects of backward time travel, it's not dirty at all. It actually makes a lot of sense, and we can look at it in realistic terms, understand these relationships across different slices of time.
Well, no, I love this. This is giving me much comfort. Interstellar, I think, is probably then a good example of that, the way it's portrayed. Because what you're saying is that no matter what you do, it already happened.
Yeah.
So you can get a message from some odd something, right? In Interstellar, it's a transmission through the time space field. And that transmission puts you on a track to go in the future and just give that transmission anyway. And it continues so on and so forth. So in this theory, there really was no first of anything.
That's the thing. Because, okay, so another good way of thinking of it is trying to find the corner on a ball.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't one, and that's fine. Balls don't have to have corners. In fact, they work a lot better without them. So we're used to thinking of things in linear terms, the arrow of time, the past cause creates a future effect. But in the presence of a time machine, that ceases to exist. And I understand why people don't like this idea. My children, especially going through kindergarten, first grade, are always coming home with these worksheets where they have to cut out pictures and put them in the right order. We're taught this. We're brainwashed, essentially, to think that time is linear, when in fact, almost everything in physics, outside of some aspects of quantum mechanics, they make just as much sense running from future to past as they do past to future. They're time independent. But our biological being, our consciousness that sits upon these dendrites and these neurons in our brain, to make sense of the world, has to impose linearity on it. We have to see things taking place in one particular way. We could be running backwards. We could be running forward. We happen to be running forward. The arrow of time marches on. But that doesn't mean that backward time travel can't happen. And even though it challenges our preconceived notions of the way the world works, there's nothing that actually stands in the way of it.
Okay, we're going to open up the Paranormal Radio app phone lines now. So if you want to call in, the number is 85KGRA Live. You can ask any question related to this topic tonight or anything paranormal if you have any ideas that you think that Michael might be able to inform you upon. Because, Michael, in this world that you work in, surely the subject of the paranormal comes up, right?
Yeah, actually, I remember going to a lecture in graduate school. I wish I could remember dude's name because we might have some things to talk about. But he was looking at the question of Bigfoot and Sasquatch from a biological, anthropological perspective. That's kind of what we do. We study human evolution and bipedal hominins and whatnot. So we're in a pretty good position to answer questions related to that phenomenon. But he just went for it. He was on this circuit touring around talking about Bigfoot in the context of Gigantopithecus and the potential offshoots and how it might actually happen, delving into the question. And that was one of the first times I saw anything paranormal being discussed within this field. And I think that's important. Like I said, we should, if we're in a position to ask this question and to get it answers, we should be doing that. If we're looking right down that telescope at something because we have the telescope, why not use it to look farther and to answer things that are farther off and more obscure and less easily observable?
Do you think that our studying the paranormal or even just science at large, asking these big questions, do they help us on the inside as individuals?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's so funny you asked that. I was just thinking about that on the way up to my office this morning. So one thing that I love about studying humans is that we are them. And by studying the very long history of our species in both the cultural and biological sense, we get a deeper understanding of things that we do now, like certain behaviors that we have today, reasons why we do things. And it's so useful, I think, a lot of these I'm just taking a shower, frustrated about some situation that's happening. We all have this. We lay awake at night and we're tossing and turning. And obviously, being a scientist doesn't solve all of our problems, but it does give us a way of thinking of it, depending on what area of science, that almost provides more context, and especially in anthropology, deeper context, the history aspects, the cultural and the biological aspects. So yeah, no, I think it's tremendously important. And even beyond that, like one thing that we also do in anthropology specifically is forensic anthropology, where if there's a murder, they find bones in the forest. I just got called by the sheriff's department here in Butte, Montana in the springtime to go look at a bunch of bones they found that came out the wall of an old brothel in town here.
My gosh.
And they thought, maybe it was something nefarious, and I went through the bones and worked with these detectives for a while, and it's important. It's important that we do those things. We have a set of skills that give us the ability to help other people, not just in anthropology, but all of these different fields. And I think it's important that we do that. That's one of the main reasons why part of our job as professors is service. We're expected to teach, do research, publish papers, get grants, and then service, just to help people out, because we sometimes have knowledge and skills that enable that.
And I think that maybe this isn't the best analogy, but I think it works. So if you are a school teacher and that's your thing, but you also spend time working on cars, and so you're an amateur mechanic, or a pretty good mechanic, but that's not your full-time gig, right? It's something you do on the side. You learned because you were curious. You just enjoy it. Now, you're just going about your everyday life. You're on the highway. Somebody's car breaks down. You happen to know how to help them. And I think that's kind of what science does. It's often accidentally assisting. You don't know where it's going to take us, right? But we know that eventually there are benefits from the study of scientists, and you don't have to constantly, the person who stops and helps fix the car doesn't have to be across the world volunteering necessarily, right? For humanitarian issues. They're helping in their own way on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know. I think that works. What do you think?
Yeah, we all help each other. We all should help each other. And yeah, you're right. It's not just scientists. We can all help each other in different ways. We tend to deal in the esoteric, the things that are a little more obscure and conceptual, but yeah, I mean, there's so many applications to knowledge and skill sets in any capacity, not just in science, but across the spectrum. Any specific skill set that someone has that can be used to help people, I think we should all be working together to make somebody's life just a little bit better, and then collectively all of us move toward this happy, healthy human society.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought. Okay, I'm going to go to the first phone line. Ron from Minnesota, you are on the air, sir.
Hey, Alan, how you doing? And hello to your guest. I always forget the name when I say that.
It's Michael. Do you have a question for him?
Yes. So about the time travel, okay, I have a slight problem with that. I think most of the best case scenarios is where it's hit and miss on the time travel phenomenon. Okay, for instance, if I hear people say, "Oh well, if I could do that again, or if I can go back in time and change that, and I'd do it differently." Well, the problem that we have is that we're the same person, and we're going to make the same stupid mistake if we keep trying to redo it. Okay, we're not going to be able to replay it, and try to change it and do it any differently, because with the same set of things in line, we're going to react the same way. And
so
do
you're
the
saying
same
like our
response.
brains mechanics are the way they are at that point in time. So even if we come back in time and warn ourselves, don't do this, we're not
Yes.
changing
Yes.
ourselves fundamentally.
Yes. And so now I wonder, on the time travel point, if that's us in the future, like I asked before on the chat, how long did it take us to get to that point? Basically. And I don't know if
I
that's
guess
the
another way to look
ask
at that too, Ron and Michael, would be, when did it happen?
Oh, yeah.
Because if how long have we been looking back upon ourselves? Because if you can time travel, it seems to be infinite, right, Michael?
Well, there might be limitations associated with how far back in time you could actually go. But you're right, that's an important question, is when did it happen versus when are the ones we're seeing from? From when are those from? And that was the question that was asked, is we're looking at these gray creatures, when did they come from specifically? But it's very possible that we could figure out the mechanisms of backward time travel far in advance of that. But because we still have historical records, archived records of what happened, we might just not be interested in anything in our recent past. So it's only once we get into the deep future that those individuals even find us interesting and want to come back to study us. So it's very possible that we could have time travel long before we actually see those beings with their different crania and their different craniofacial forms. I think Ron's question also actually backs up what we were talking about. I don't think he needs to be skeptical about time travel, because it fits very well within what we were just talking about, and is an argument for self-consistency and an argument for block time. Is if you went back and warned yourself of something that's going to happen, that thing's always going to happen no matter what. And if it didn't, if you changed it, then how do you ever come back to tell yourself that in the first place? If that thing never transpired, there's no one in the future that would know that, and no one who could come back to warn you about it. So the paradox is actually in the idea that we could change the past, not in the idea that there's self-consistency across.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Ron, do you have any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah. I think, we would we lose our transmission or continuity to what we were trying to teach ourselves, right?
Yeah, potentially. I mean,
that's what it
yeah, and that's the thing that comes back to what we were also talking about earlier. I think, Alan, you mentioned something, or no, one of your colleagues, about why aren't we helping ourselves? And that kind of fits into the same conversation, is that we could, and we might at some point. And again, that doesn't change anything. At any point, once we're aware of who they are and why they're here, because there aren't paradoxes necessarily associated with them sitting down and giving us information, that very well could happen. It would, again, make us really rapidly change our understanding of reality, especially for a lot of people outside of the UFO community who aren't talking about these things. It would be like somebody cracking a whip on the back of your head. Hey, wake up. There's something going on here that you guys have not been paying attention to at all. But it wouldn't change anything. It would just sort of help create the same future that already exists that they're coming from. Self-consistency is maintained.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you, Alan, again for a great show, and thank you for your guest. Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. It's great talking to you.
All right.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.
For everyone listening, that was Ron from ERT Radio, ERRT Radio. If you take the time to check them out on Mixlr. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard of the Baracus Skulls, right? The Peruvian skulls.
Are those the ones with the cranial modification?
Correct.
Where they supposedly have a larger cranial capacity than would be expected for one that had undergone intentional cranial modification?
You got it. Yeah.
All right. It's been mentioned to me a couple of times, but I'm not an expert on those particular skulls.
Okay. Have you ever had a chance to talk with Brian Forrester?
No.
He's a curator of the
first I've heard
Baracus
that.
Museum down there. Anyway, he's coming on the show next 2 weeks from now, and I think there is a fair argument to be made there, because it does appear that even if you're doing cranial boarding and misshaping the skull, the capacity of the skull should be the same.
Oh, I actually can speak to that. A big part of my general exams in graduate school was about intentional cranial modification, because my specialization was craniofacial anatomy and evolution, and that's a pretty important one, is what happens to the bones themselves when they do cranial boarding or wrapping of the cranium. So, yeah, I can't speak to those skulls in particular, but I could answer questions about that specifically.
All right. So what about any sort of intervention? Because if one entertains the idea that ancient aliens existed and intervened, well, if you marry that with your idea, then basically it says that we are the ancient aliens intervening.
Yeah. No, I've told ancient aliens that they've contacted me about being on the show a couple of times, and I said that same thing. What better way to have ancient aliens, and if we are visiting the ancient past as these aliens?
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, no, the cranial modification, you're right. It mostly is a shape change. You don't get an increase in cranial capacity associated with any form of intentional cranial modification, whether it be the boarding like the Maya did, or wrapping the skull, the neurocranium itself, with cloth, as took place in many other parts of the world.
Yeah, different mechanics, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also already a lot of variation in cranial capacity throughout the human population. We vary from about 1,400 cubic centimeters to 1,600 cubic centimeters. So I don't know. At this point, I should just look it up, because people have been asking me this since May. But yeah, it's an important question. Why would they have a larger cranial capacity and intentional cranial modification? Maybe it's just a fluke. Maybe they happen to have larger skulls. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. Maybe there's something more going on too.
Well, I think that is a good point that you make. However, if you are within the same group of people and your skeletal remains are found around others of that same time period, does that still hold up that there would be an extra 2 millimeter difference?
Well, no, you're right. If they were indigenous to that group, and they comparatively had a larger cranial capacity in relation to that group, and you accounted for sex and age and obviously body size, which is what we do in looking at brain evolution and cephalization in hominin history, is we account for body size, because obviously if you're a big person, you have a bigger skull capacity than a smaller person. Sure. So yeah, if they accounted for all those variables and those individuals had a larger cranial capacity relative to a random sample of the population, if they were indigenous to that population, then yeah, that would be considered anomalous.
Right. So everything makes sense to me so far as time travel now, because I do feel, okay, that makes sense. The fact that we would have a paradox by interfering is actually wrong, and the paradox would be that by going back in time, we can't change things. So, but what about the origin of us? So if ancient aliens were the ones that spliced our genes, took one of these hominins and said, hey, we're going to tweak this a little bit, but if that's us from the future, can that still fit in that non-paradox that you speak of?
Yeah, I don't think that happened, but it can. Absolutely, because if they always had done that, then they always will have done that.
So who came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. There's no corners on a ball.
Right.
There's no way of separating those in the context of a time machine. Why I don't think that happens is for two different reasons. One, they seem to be going out of their way to not impose themselves on these different time periods. They're picking people up in very remote places, dropping them off the clouded memories. It seems that they're going out of their way to not interject themselves into the past. The other reason I don't think that happened is because I believe there are limitations to how far back into the past they can possibly go. And this gets a little technical. I talk about it in my book in more detail that kind of builds this argument. So I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version, which will probably make no sense whatsoever. But so in reorienting light cones toward the past, and a light cone is just anything allowable by the laws of physics because it's within the boundaries of light. The speed of light is the universal speed limit. So in order to go into the past, you have to reorient those light cones toward the past. But you're still only traveling into the past at the relative speed of light. Not light, but life. Like we sense this movement forward, and you're still traveling at that speed into the past in this craft that's reorienting those light cones toward it. To get into the deep past, you would have to travel at a very high rate of speed using special relativity, that twins paradox I was talking about earlier, where that twin traveling at a high rate of speed relative to a stationary twin, relatively speaking, on Earth, is moving into the future. So if your light cone's oriented toward the past and you're traveling at a high rate of speed, you're moving into the future of that past. But you're also limited by how far you can go into that past by how fast you can go. And this characteristic where these UFOs can go at a tremendously high rate of speed, we see that and we're like, oh, they must be traveling amongst the stars. But that high speed characteristic is likely what allows them to travel into the deep past. But because of that universal speed limit of the speed of light and the inertial forces working against you as you're trying to move faster and faster,
Sure.
I think there's probably an upper limit to how deep they could actually go into the past. So I don't think they would do it. They're not doing it now. Or at least if they are, it's probably to help themselves, not to do anything to us or create some situation in their future. But I also don't think they'd be able to go back to a time when they could enact some huge macrocosmic change on hominin evolution.
Do you remember the original? I think it was the original Superman movie where Lois Lane dies in the film. And,
oh yeah, spins the world. He flies around the world.
Yeah, he flies.
Absolutely,
and he turns back time.
Yeah.
If everything is happening simultaneously, even if you can move at extraordinary speeds faster than the speed of light, you can't turn back time itself, right? It's not a clock.
Not globally, no. If you are in a craft that is warping space-time, you are still moving forward into the future locally in your localized reference frame, but you are moving into the global past. So you're not turning back global space-time. You're not causing everyone to see time moving backwards. Just you individually in that bubble of space-time warpage that you've created, are you moving into the global past? So yeah, you're right. That's another example of taking the idea of backward time travel and representing it in a way that's not factually accurate.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, Michael. When you have read, I'm sure you've read reports of abduction cases. You're familiar with Free's work. Is there any physical, biological evidence in the way that these aliens look or be or move that are indicators to you, that signal to you that, aha, these are humans, besides the fact that they have 2 legs, 2 arms, and what have you?
Well, I think those 2 legs and 2 arms are hugely important.
It's pretty big.
Yeah, that's pretty big. That's what defines our lineage.
But besides that, was there anything that you would notice that maybe lay people like myself wouldn't?
Yeah, the larger eyes are a good example. I study I study the evolutionary anatomy specifically. I mentioned craniofacial evolution, but I focused on the eyes and the eye orbits and how the orbits change throughout evolutionary time. And I also do biomedical research on the eye and the rectus muscles and the fat around the eye in comparison across different ancestral groups and between the sexes, and looking at it in the context of juvenile onset myopia, nearsightedness, specifically astigmatism, what's going on in the eye itself. And to me, in all of these abduction reports, I think that's what the abductees also notice that connects them to these individuals. They say the eyes are the window to the soul. And I don't care if you're from the future or the past or now, you look into a human's eyes or a dog's eyes or a scared animal's eyes, you see things that don't need to be said in words.
Yeah.
You sense an energy. Their consciousness is connected to your own. And in all of these abduction reports, the ones where people actually look and they're calm, they're sedated, whether it be telepathically or with some actual sedative, they see that humanness in their eyes. So yeah, even beyond the expanding neurocrania, the retracting and reduced nasomaxillary complex, the mandible, and the bipedalism, and the pentadactyly, and all of these other traits, their eyes, to me, are the ones that are really, I think, important to this conversation.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it was a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so do you have any conferences or anything coming up that you'd like to share with everyone out there?
Actually, yeah, just the other day, I was invited to Contact in the Desert, which I believe is down in Palm Springs. I haven't been yet, but I've heard a lot of good things about it, so I'm looking forward to that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're working on a TV docu-series and podcast, and yeah, just trying to continue the conversation to keep the dialogue open and to try to batten down the hatches on the stigma that's been so pervasive throughout time. So yeah, just talking and traveling and having good conversations with folks like yourself.
All right, appreciate it. Yeah, I'm glad you're infusing the conversation with your own work. If you want to find out more about Michael P. Masters, go to idflyobj.com, idflyobj.com, and you can get his book, Identified Flying Objects. You've been listening to Paranormal Now, broadcasting live Tuesdays, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard on KGR Radio, your official contact for the best in alternative talk radio. To find out more, you can go to kgrradio.com/paranormalnow, paranormalnow.net, or on social media on Facebook.com/paranormalnow. Join us next week, 8 p.m., with our guest, Tui Snyder, and we'll be talking about haunted places and true, in all caps, true ghost stories. And of course, once again, if you can go to YouTube, search for Paranormal Pop, and then add Alan B. Smith, the Paranormal Pop YouTube page will pop up, and you can follow us there with the new series called Coffee and UFOs. It's fun. We'll be having new shows every week, and I think you'll really appreciate it. Stay tuned for Fade to Black with Jimmy Church, and special thanks to KGRA producer Bill Skywatcher. Until next time, live in the mystery.